I'm Tim Westerbeck, president of Eduvantis, a strategic consulting firm serving more than 100 of the world's top higher education institutions. Eric Anderson, professor of marketing at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern, joins the Business Education Revolution podcast to discuss the profound impact artificial intelligence will have on business education. He's an expert on AI and author of an industry-leading text on the subject. More than 20,000 managers have taken his courses on AI. Eric also co-founded and launched the MBAI program, a joint degree offered with Northwestern's McCormick School of Engineering and the Kellogg School. So, Eric, how much do you think most business schools today really understand what they're getting into with AI? Do they really grasp how big this is going to be, or do they really grasp what they're going to need to do to be effective in using it?
It's a great question, Tim. I think that the answers are all over the place. And so I think it depends on who you talk to. So if you talk to the dean or some of the senior leaders, they're all aware that this is going to be transformational. They're just not sure how it's going to transform and what it might take to get there. As you get into the ranks of the faculty, I think there's a little bit of disagreement amongst different faculty in terms of how big this will be. Some faculty, like myself, think this is going to be transformational. Others are going to be like, well, we've been through a lot of fads. We've seen one fad after another throughout my career, and this is just another fad. I think it's not going to be a fad. I think it's going to be something that will be here for decades. And by the time I retire, I think you'll look back and say this is one of the biggest things that happened in education. Okay,
so you used the word transformational there. Now, transformational can mean a lot of things. If you read the popular media, we're on the edge of Armageddon with AI coming in to fundamentally disrupt really everything.
Right.
And then other people view it as a tool that can be used to help us all become more effective or efficient. Where do you put your transformational in on that spectrum?
I think it's, if you had to rate it, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's 10 out of 10. And I put it in perspective by saying it's impacting every business today. Everyone wants to talk about it in the popular press. You can go to any major outlet. They want to talk about how it's impacting their business. Now step back to our world of education and how we train MBA students to learn about best practices in different domains. We are organized around marketing, my field, operations, finance, accounting, strategy, right? We're siloed up. And then if you ask, where's the Department of AI? It does not exist. We do not have a Department of AI, and it doesn't fit anywhere. And so you're asking, why is it going to be so transformational? We have to figure out how to integrate this into our existing structure. And I think that's what all of the senior leaders are wrestling with is, where do you put this? How do you make advancements here when we don't have a department that this naturally fits inside?
What you're describing is pretty fundamental stuff, fundamental structural things and operating issues and such. And there's no doubt that AI is just getting started, right? I mean, we're in the infant stages of knowing what to do with this. How are academic institutions going to keep up with the rate of change and expansion and use of AI? How should they orient themselves toward that?
I think everyone's revisiting how to organize and how to think about, how should you integrate any new fundamental transformation like this into an organization, right? And I'll give you an example that took place maybe 15 to 20 years ago, which would be, we tried to move away from being very sort of US-centric as US business schools into being much more global. And so there was a huge push at the time in many, many business schools to say, we need a global version of what you're doing. We need you to be attentive to what's happening in South America, in Europe. Wherever this is, look beyond the walls of the United States. So we launched classes in international channel management, not just channel management, international finance, not just finance. That's all gone away, right? And now international is integrated into all of our curriculum. And I think we're going to go through that transformation with AI, where it's going to be sort of this extra thing for a while, and eventually you're going to find it deeply integrated into all of your core activities in marketing and finance and accounting. Doesn't matter where we look, you're going to see AI everywhere. The challenge is how you get there and what that transformation is going to look like, because the expertise doesn't sit inside our existing system.
Well, that's one thing I'm trying to get at too, and welcome your thoughts on this, is what does it actually look like for a professor to use AI effectively? What does it look like for a student to be learning how to use AI and developing the competencies that they need? What's that going to look like actually in practice?
Yeah, so in my world, it starts with way before all of the generative AI and ChatGPT and all the things we talk about today into the world of analytics. Because analytics is actually the building block for most of what's in, we think about as, I'll call it old school AI, old school machine learning. And so it's understanding really how to use data for making decisions, right? And how to integrate all of those things together. And so my retail analytics class was really focused in on, how do you use data for decision making in retail settings? And you could say like, well, where does AI come in? It comes in as like part of the umbrella of tools that one would use in sort of making those decisions. And to me, that was like the starting point of, understanding the sophistication of those tools have gone from sort of basic things that we used to teach 20 years ago. The tools became way, way more advanced. And so you're in the world of largely data-driven tools, which would be like, how do I forecast revenue? Or how do I make the next marketing decision? And now with generative AI, it's completely different. It's yet another set of tools that we need to integrate. So I actually try to keep in my mind the two things separate, because the generative AI world is actually really quite different from the things we saw 2 years ago.
That's one of the things I'm wondering as well, is it's one thing to say this is a more sophisticated tool to help us use our analytical capabilities and skills more effectively. It's another to, I was reading an article the other day, they were talking about students wanting to use this almost as a second brain. It's another way of adding almost another entire mode of thinking that doesn't exist now. That's going to be used in a fundamentally different and more advanced way than just doing analytics. Do you buy that?
The general idea, yes, right? And what it has become is that most of these tools, which are based on large language models, and we think of them, in the popular press as ChatGPT and its different iterations, what they are is a way of ingesting data and creating outputs in a way we never thought were possible. And so it can take, just this weekend, we took my entire book, put it all into chat, and now you can ask it questions, right? And, works great. You can actually...
It's easier on you, for sure.
Well, and if you're a student or you're a learner and you want to read something and you go, I can't remember something, could you give me a quick summary? Boom, it generates the answer instantly. So you can type into our tool, we create a little bot. It'll allow you to interact with it, and it does a great job of helping you sort of learn if that's your goal. What you have to remember is what people don't understand is the limitations. Like, where does it fall apart? And that's where you start to see some of the risks where, it can't do certain things, or it gives you the incorrect answer. And when the consequences of that are substantial, that's where you start to worry about, okay, are you aware of the boundaries and do you understand the boundaries of what it's good at? So what it's currently good in my example of is I can ask it questions that I know exist, the answers exist in my book, and it gets great answers. You push that too far, it's not going to work. Right?
When you say it's not going to work, is that a function of the development of the technology today versus where it will be 5 years or 10 years from now?
These tools only know what they're trained on. Right? So if you've trained it on a certain set of data, it's good at answering questions about that environment. But if you haven't trained it on that, it gives a really poor answer. And just last week I was joking, because we're doing some stuff on AI with the board of directors that I'm on. And I said, well, let's see who ChatGPT thinks is the CEO. Ask it the question, who's the CEO? Correct answer. Who's the chairman of the board? Completely incorrect answer. Doesn't have the current chairman of the board, despite the fact the chairman of the board's been in that role for 3 years. And then you ask why, because it's not trained on that data. It didn't know about that. Now, once you tell it the answer, it'll remember it. It understands this as part of reinforcement learning, and now it's going to know the answer. But you had to know this was the wrong answer. All right, and so this is some of the limitations that you get into.
Well, what about the idea that this will become a sentient being in a sense? It's not just learning based on the data and information and access that it's had, but it becomes a thinking enterprise. Is that something that makes sense to you and that you could see happening, and what are some of the implications of that?
I think we're far away from that right now. We haven't quite gotten to that state. But you do hear stories that give you pause along that line, which is, you never thought that this tool was supposed to know how to translate between English and another language, but it just taught itself how to do this. So why did it do this? And we don't quite know why, but it clearly discovered there was a gap. And these tools often are reward seeking. And if it thinks that gathering in this new information is going to be viewed as a reward, it'll go do it. And so I think no one quite knows what the path was by this, it decided to go down this path. But it's interesting, right? I think it's an interesting thing that might happen, that, it can go out and gather new information. Does it become creepy? Yeah, at some point it might become quite creepy, and you have to start thinking about the ethics, and what you're worried about in terms of where this is going to take us.
Along that line, let's talk about students for a moment.
Sure.
It's very clear that every business on the planet seemingly is trying to get involved with the use of AI and wants to make it a bigger and bigger part of the way it does really everything that it does, which suggests to me that the students who are coming out of business schools today and are going to go into these environments are going to need to have a certain set of skills in terms of how to use this, how not to use it, what it can do, what it can't do, and have it be part of a core competency as much as any other competency that they might have had.
Right.
Where are we on that? What do we need to be thinking about now to make sure we're in that kind of a position?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to frame that question in the context of a business school student. And I say that largely from the perspective of some of the things that have to take place here are, I'll call it the deep science. And I don't think many business school students are going to have a heavy influence in sort of writing algorithms and coming up with the next algorithmic approach one might use in machine learning or AI. But what they will be involved with is using these tools to solve applied problems in the business situations that they face. And that's where they have to feel comfortable working. So now you're asking yourself, what skills do you need? You need to understand how the tools work from an intuitive level and how to manage people, data, and processes in that environment. And I think that's one of the big skill gaps that needs to be closed. And it's transformational, that I come back to that word, from the perspective of, we often would teach you things like insight. Here's some data, here's the insight. Or here's a problem that Tim faces, what's the best solution? Where things have gone because of AI and the emphasis we've had is it's largely driven by world of engineering. And engineers don't often care about, the why. They just care about, all right, how do we make this work, and how do we build it into a system? How do we do it over and over again, and does it work? And the proof here is not in the deep theory, it's does it actually work effectively? And I think getting into that mindset of building systems that work effectively is a huge transformation for a lot of business school education, because you're really changing everything we do, right? You're not saying it's great in marketing to come up with the perfect solution to target Tim with an offer today. It's like, great, we did that today. What are you going to do next week? What do you do next month? And how do I automate that and scale that across the enterprise? That is new for a lot of people.
Well, that's another of the statements. It's really going to change everything we do.
Right.
My company, as you know, works with a lot of different business schools, and I haven't run across one yet that isn't really wrestling with this, a recognition of this gap between sort of where they are now and where they're going to need to be to have this become a functional competency of graduates to be able to use it across all contexts like they would use math.
Yep.
Or English or anything else to do their work. Can you talk a little bit about that? How should we be thinking about that as schools today?
So I think where you're going to see a big transformation I'll put it, the very first experiences MBA students have when they come into a program. One of the very first classes you often learn is something around data analytics. It's almost true at every school. There's going to be something where we have to teach you about statistics and maybe regression and how to process data and make decisions with data. I think that is going to get blown up at some point, in the sense that how do you introduce these concepts of systems into that? How do you introduce AI and machine learning and some of these new tools into that environment? That's where I think you're going to see the big transformation, is in those courses. We now want you to have foundational skills and familiarity with these tools so that then we can build upon them when you get to a marketing class or a finance class or an accounting class. And what that looks like at every school is going to change. That's going to be a change that I think every school is going to have to wrestle with. And so creating relevance with statistics and regression was always a challenge for a lot of schools, just to figure out how do you make that something that resonates with the students and they can use in their day-to-day lives. And now I think AI and machine learning are going to go into that bucket and have to be figured out. And we often lack expertise. We may not have the experts today to do that. I think that's another gap that has to be filled.
Now, in that scenario, you're putting it in a bucket. You're making it a central component of the learning that gets applied across all contexts, if I understood you right.
Right.
Isn't it going to simply change the way we teach marketing or finance or any of the other major disciplines? Because it seems like this is an entirely new way of thinking about doing things in the practice of those subject areas.
I think it will, and I think what it's going to do is bring data and tools that are used to process that data and gather, make decisions and build systems to be much more at the forefront. I think that's where you're going to see a bit of a transformation is those things that maybe just sort of hinted at are now much more front and center. But you sort of need to layer in the building blocks. You're going to show up at my marketing class, what do you know about this? And today the answer is it's a mixed bag. Some people come in with a lot of experience, other people don't have experience, and there's not a foundational common set of skills. Whereas in other domains, I know what the foundation is. And I think the first thing it'll change is the foundations. And then to your point, the second thing is the actual way we teach different disciplines will transform. So one of my favorite examples is one of my colleagues in accounting is using, as of 2 years ago, well before chat, he's using natural language processing to analyze disclosures and combining that text analysis with the financial analysis to explain to the students, hey, look at all these new insights we can get. Now you're really utilizing the tools in a new way. And he could do it with my class of MBAI students because they knew how to program in Python, they knew how to use the natural language processing tools, and he could easily incorporate all of that into his introductory accounting class. Not advanced accounting, this was like the first accounting class you take.
There's some pretty advanced stuff that's going on in a basic accounting class based on sort of prior knowledge that the students had and skill sets that we're able to sort of adapt to use, I think, AI functionality in a way to create something.
Right.
I think that's what you're getting at.
And so the reason that the accounting professor could do this is because the MBAI students have a grounding in sort of AI tools as well as programming languages and come in a lot more teched up than your traditional student coming into that accounting class. And you could ignore that base of knowledge and just teach a traditional accounting class, but the accounting professor was like, no, this is a super exciting opportunity. And so now you see what does it take for the transformation, that foundation of skills, and then the excitement of the faculty member to completely revamp their class and incorporate text analysis and natural language processing into accounting. And the students absolutely love the class, right? I think it went from being sort of like, okay, it's an accounting class to like, wow, this is why I came to Kellogg, right? Was to get that unique experience that I couldn't get elsewhere.
Now, what about these students who don't have the MBAI experience? Is there some risk here of sort of a regression to the mean of students who they just don't have the skills and the technology sort of takes over and they lose their ability to be effective and to learn?
I'm not sure. I think what you're going to see is this becomes what everyone has. I think these are going to be this is going to be a requirement of all the students. Right now, it's in a narrow pocket of students that have decided this is what we want to be experts in. But I think it's not going to be very long before we see everyone having to embrace this. I don't think you can go into the MBA world without understanding these things today. Doesn't matter what part you're going into. You have to know something about technology.
Is this going to change, do you think, the kinds of students who can go into and succeed in what sounds like an increasingly complex environment in order to be effective? Is it going to change the landscape of who goes to MBA programs?
I don't think it's going to drastically change who's coming to MBA programs. I think it's going to change what they look like when they come out. I think we're still going to see a lot of desire to come back to MBA programs to advance their degree or advance their education and get a master's degree. I don't think we're going to see that drastically changing. But I do think we're going to see a big change in terms of what's expected of them. And as a consequence, if you step back and think about the entire field of business and business education, those that are slow to transform are going to be left behind very quickly. I think you have to keep at the forefront of your graduates are going to become, able to move into these careers where they can integrate business with technology, and it's going to be everywhere. So the interesting part is it doesn't fit in one silo of, hey, these are marketing jobs or finance jobs or strategy jobs. It's everywhere. And that's why I said from your very first question that AI is going to be transformational. It is the first thing I've seen that cuts across the entire enterprise of a business, the entire enterprise of a business school. You can't get away from it. It's everywhere.
Can you tell me a little bit about your fears, if you will? You're very positive. You're deeply involved in this. You're on the front lines of it. You understand it like a lot of people might not, what's happening and how to deal with it and such. Are there risks here that we haven't fully captured and understood as an industry for Business School X? Are there risks here?
I think the risks are out there. And if you ask, there already are discussions around should we pump the brakes on this and slow things down so that we keep it under control. And so you're hearing some of the most respected leaders in the AI field saying, let's make sure we actually have this buttoned down before it gets out of hand. And I do think that's a risk that we have to be aware of. And so my view is you want to be part of that policy conversation and not on the sidelines, just accepting what comes out of it. But it's going to be a collaboration between policymakers, educational institutions, corporations, trying to figure out what are the best policies here and how do we keep things, in line, because there's always the potential of a misstep. I think what's changed is not the potential of a misstep, but the scale and the speed with which this can happen. And so I think that's probably the biggest challenge right now. We've always had the challenge that data could take us in a direction. We're like, oh, you're not using that data in a way we think is ethical. That's always been a concern, and we put policies in to maybe mitigate those risks. But now we don't quite know what the boundaries are or the speed with which new things might emerge. And that's what I see as the biggest risks.
I mean, it's one thing to say, there's risks here. This is different. We have to have policies. We have to understand this in a more integrated way. There's dangers here that perhaps didn't exist in the past. How do you frame an analysis of understanding what those policies should be?
So the best answer to that is there was a conference held in Europe at the end of 2023 involving 20 plus countries, academic leaders, and corporations. And at the end of that, they agreed to appoint a very respected AI leader in Canada from University of Montreal to write a report. It's due in 6 months, so we'll start to see this at end of May, beginning of June, about what should be the recommended international policy on AI. And I think those are things where it's the start of a structured conversation. But you see the players all showing up, right? Government agencies, academics, corporations, we're all at this meeting. And we'll start to see how it unfolds. And they didn't give them 2 years to write the report. They had 6 months. And so we'll come back and we'll know a lot more, I would suspect, by end of May, June timeframe as to what the next steps will be.
Now, you mentioned that you've been participating in a Big Ten group that's sort of looking at the implementation of AI in their institutions and such. And is there something you could share a little bit about that, about how that's going and what's the focus of attention?
Sure, it's super informal, but it was basically a group of folks that decided, why don't we get together and have a small group of us discuss what's happening at our various institutions, what are some of the challenges you face, what's working well, what's not working well, to try and share best practices. And I think it's a good example for people to hear, because we're all from very different institutions, but there's a tremendous amount you can learn from each other just by talking about what's happening at your school. And the frontier is moving so quickly, it's very hard to understand what's the next challenge you'll face. So I think it points out that if you're going to make progress here, you're going to have to collaborate. You're going to have to start to figure out, how can I learn from other folks, whether it's other academic institutions, other companies, right? This idea of collaborating across different domains is going to be really critical.
Where is the frontier right now?
The frontier is always moving, Tim. That's probably the only universal
Spotted
truth.
in time today. Where is the frontier?
So I'll give you a funny story from last week. So we had a discussion last week as a faculty about large language models and ChatGPT and its use in classrooms. And my colleague, who I think is really at the frontier of doing this in the classroom, I said, well, how do you get there? And he's like, yeah, if you really dedicate yourself, you can get there in, say, 2 to 4 weeks of, you read a lot of things and you'll figure out exactly what the state of the art is. And then he's like, the challenge is that in 4 more weeks, you'll no longer be at the frontier because the frontier is just constantly moving. And he also said, be careful when someone tells you they're at the frontier, they're really not, because it's very hard to stay there. It's just this constantly moving frontier where it's changing every day. The algorithms are changing every day. The problems are changing every day. And so it's just something you always have to just constantly be investing in and understanding, what's the next thing I need to be diagnosing and understanding, is it useful? Is it not useful? It's very different than what we've ever faced.
That suggests to me that for any business school to be effective at creating the competencies that it needs to in its students and its faculty to be able to keep up with this, that's not a natural state of being for most business schools, to be able to adapt and move that quickly. What else is going to have to change if we have, a hope of being able to do that effectively?
I think the number one thing that must change is going to be sort of the culture of the institutions. We're often used to sort of building things that last forever, right? We have this knowledge base of like fundamental core truths that last forever. That still is true, but in this particular application area, it's recognizing this isn't true. In fact, it's designed to be beaten. And it comes back to like this fundamental, I think the culture of the computer science world is all around, well, what's value? Value is beating the incumbent. Going out there and showing you can do it better, right? And so that pushes the frontier by definition. It's not coming up with a better explanation for why you're there. It's just constantly pushing the frontier. And that's something we've never faced before, is an entire field that is based on pushing the frontier and constantly changing what we're doing. And so I think that's something that business schools are going to wrestle with. Whereas like principles of marketing have not changed for decades, right? The way in which we execute marketing has changed, but some of the fundamental principles have lasted for quite some time.
So if you were to sort of close out this conversation by saying, if there's something I would like my colleagues in business education, deans, faculty members, et cetera, to know and to be thinking really hard about, here are the 3 things that I think that's what these would be.
Boy, you sort of have to begin by asking who your audience is. But if you're speaking to the dean, I think the very first thing you want to be thinking about is the faculty themselves. And first, starting with your existing faculty and ask who's going to embrace this and who's going to upskill and really make this part of their DNA and say, we're bringing it to the classroom, we're going to bring it into our research, this is going to be something that we embrace. And then the other part of the faculty equation is, how do I augment that with gaps that I find, where there's going to be some skills that we need that we don't have? How do those fit into the jigsaw puzzle of my organization? I think that is if you don't have the faculty behind you, it's very hard to do anything in this domain. The second is, I think you really can't make any progress on this unless you really start to understand applications. It's not a data-driven enterprise. It's an application-driven enterprise. And I think we're often too distant from the applications or too stale. And so I think I'd ask the organization, like, how do we advance the organization to really understand what are the state-of-the-art problems that businesses face that our students need to be knowing about, right? And then you put those 2 things together. All right, how do I take those applications with my faculty and integrate these into different disciplines? How do I integrate them into marketing, finance, operations, accounting, strategy, and get them throughout the organization? And I think as you do that, you start to see not only the education part of the business school change, but you'll see the entire enterprise of research be transformed through this process, because I think you'll start to see like, oh, this is the way businesses function. this is the way we should be thinking about research, I think you'll find the whole thing come full circle to really change the way organizations operate.
Well, doesn't it, in a sense, make every business case obsolete that we've ever written?
Maybe not obsolete, but we need to rethink them, right? I think we often, I've written many business cases myself that stop at insight and an answer to a problem, as opposed to the implementation of a system that constantly recognizes, okay, what do we do in this situation? And I think that's the step that you're going to start to see closed, right? That you're going to say, like, okay, can we take these cases to the next level? What would it mean to keep going with this? And what's the next thing you'd start working on?
All right. Very good. Eric Anderson, I appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts on this. I'm sure there's more to discuss as we go, but I appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts, and I'm sure a lot of people will benefit from them. So thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jim.